Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for our Autism Diagnosis and Early Support webinar held in collaboration between Therapy Focus and Kind. My name is Brett from Brand Engagement at Therapy Focus, and I'll be facilitating the session. Today we have two of our speakers, Emily Turner and Kelly Scott, both Senior Speech Pathologists from Therapy Focus, and they'll be helping and guiding you through with some insightful information. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that the session will be recorded, and we'll make that available on both websites in the days following the session. There'll also be a Kind email sent out to registrants with a recording of this session as well. Thank you to everyone who's provided questions already on sign up. We'll do our best to answer as many of these as possible, either during the session or at the end in the Q&A. There's also a Q&A function in this meeting that we welcome you to add any additional questions you might have throughout the session. And again, time permitting, we'll do our best to address these. If we don't get to them all, we'll try and send some post-session communications around some of those burning questions you might have. So that's all for me from now. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to Carrie Clark, CEO of Kind, to do the acknowledgement of country and let us know the amazing work that the team at Kind do.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Carrie Clark, the CEO of Kind, and I'm delighted to have you all here today for another one of our Wisdom webinar series. As Brett said, we're covering autism diagnosis and early supports, and we've got Kelly and Emily here from Therapy Focus. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are on and pay my respects to all elders past and present. Now, many of you are familiar with Kind and the work we do, but some of you might not be, so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about us. We are an independent peer support organisation founded in the late 80s by a group of parents who were caring for children with disabilities, and they got together and they just went, oh my God, this is hard. What if we all join together? What if we support one another? And we've been doing that ever since and have since grown to support over 6,000 families in WA. All of our team have lived experience of being the parent or family member of a person with a disability. And we really focus on helping parents navigate through the absolute maze of different systems that you have to do every day. Systems like early intervention, NDIS, education or health. And we also help you to find good services and supports for your child and for your whole family. You know, things that you might not know that you're eligible for or that you might not know that are available out there for you. Another one of our big focuses is on connecting families with one another, because we all know that you are all experts in this area. And we've got a lot of different parent support groups that you might want to join. All of our services are free, completely free for families. So I urge you to get in contact with us and connect with us, because I'm sure that we will be able to help you. We also have a range of different information resources on our website, and this webinar forms part of that information, those information resources. And we really enjoy partnering with great organisations like Therapy Focus, who are experts in this field. So I think today is going to be really informative, and I am delighted to have the wonderful Kelly and Emily with us. I'm going to leave you in their very safe hands, and hopefully I will get to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Oh, I think you were muted, Brett, but I'm pretty sure you introduced me as Emily, which is true. I am going to be just giving you a bit of an overview of what we're hoping to cover today, which is, of course, is to unpack this idea of autism. I'm going to talk through what's meant by that tricky term of autism spectrum. I'm also going to go through the diagnostic criteria and really try and give you some idea of what those autistic traits actually look like. And then I'll give you an overview of the pathways to diagnosis in WA before handing over to Kelly, who's going to talk about those the supports that are available, and the really important shift towards neuro-affirming care. So to start with, I really wanted to make a note on the language that we're going to use throughout. There's a general consensus amongst the majority of autistic people that they prefer identity first language, so being referred to as an autistic person rather than a person with autism. That identity first language just makes it really clear that being autistic is an inherent part of who a person is and their identity. So just as I might describe myself as Australian rather than person with Australia. So the disclaimer here is that not every single autistic person is going to prefer that identity first language, and so we want to honour individual preferences, and we can do this really by just asking the person if you're not sure. And for adults or teens, that might look like asking, do you consider yourself a person with autism or an autistic person? When I've done this myself, when working with autistic teens and adults, they've really appreciated that question. And as parents of young autistic children, this might be a conversation you have with your kids as they grow up and they mature and they form their own opinions, but it's something certainly to think about. But throughout this presentation, we're going to use identity first language. Following on from that, I really wanted to also acknowledge that the language used in diagnosis is not at all affirming. The process itself is inherently deficits focused, in that much of the time diagnosticians are looking for what the child or the young person is not doing. So in diagnostic reports, you're very likely to see language like that on the left there, words like impairment and deficit and symptoms. Really medicalised language that has an undertone that autism is something that needs to be fixed or corrected, which is simply not true. And thankfully, our understanding is shifting, and autism is considered exactly what it is, which is simply a neurological variation rather than a disorder. On a personal note, and I know that Therapy Focus shares this perspective, I feel that language is really important. And when I'm writing reports, I'm aware that the young person may one day read the report about themselves. And I want to be accurate, but I want to be affirming at the same time. And I'd really encourage you to seek out therapists that demonstrate understanding of the social model that we're moving towards. Okay, so what is autism? Very simply put, autism is a neurodivergence, and as that word suggests, neuro refers to the brain and divergence refers to the differences to what is typical within a whole population. So it might be differences in learning, in thinking, in the ways that we communicate, any number of things that we're going to unpack a little bit more later on. But it's important to note that it's a lifelong disability, meaning that this is something that you are born with, and those brain differences will remain across the person's life, the entire life. So it's important to note that how an autistic person functions can fluctuate greatly in the short term, like across a day even, and the long term, so over their lifetime, and that can be due to any number of factors, perhaps the support that they're receiving or not receiving, what the environment's like, what their stress level is like from day to day. Many families want to know the cause of autism, and we currently don't know, but research does suggest that there is a strong genetic link, and this is evidenced by the fact that autism does tend to run in families. What we do know quite clearly is what does not cause autism, and we know that it is not caused by bad parenting, whatever that looks like or sounds like. It certainly is not caused by vaccinations, as was suggested decades ago, but has since been really comprehensively refuted, nor is it caused by external events that might happen later in life, like traumatic brain injury, for example. These things don't bring on autism. As we've said, it is something you are born with. So I did want to talk about the word spectrum. We've all heard it, autism spectrum disorder, but it is really quite misleading. And many autistic people consider that term spectrum to at best be really unhelpful and at worst be quite degrading. It's frequently misinterpreted as an indicator of severity, and you might hear people say, oh, he's very autistic, or, oh gosh, I didn't even know that you're autistic. I can't even tell you're autistic. Just as you can't be a little bit pregnant, you are either autistic or not. So instead of this linear view that you're seeing here, it can be really helpful to understand the dynamic and highly individual nature of autism. So in reality, autism can be visualised in this way, with each segment of the wheel representing an autistic trait or characteristic, and the depth of the colour as it moves from the centre to the outside of the circle representing the level of challenge that poses for the individual. So we'll go into the traits in more detail in just a moment. But for example, if we look at these two diagrams here, they represent autistic people, but you can see they look quite different. The autistic person represented on the left might have difficulty regulating emotions or being flexible in their routine, for example, and that might be indicated by the dark yellow and orange segments. But otherwise, they use a variety of facial expressions and vocal tones to express themselves. Whereas the person represented on the right, they might use coordinated eye contact and gesture really easily, but have trouble starting conversations or interpreting sarcasm, for example, and that would be represented by the dark green and red segments. So these are just examples, but hopefully that illustrates more clearly that while autism is identified by a typical set of features, the constellation of traits that any individual person experiences can vary widely between individuals. Okay, so what are these autistic traits? They are broken into two broad categories. We've got the purple social communication criteria, and I've written them as differences, but in your diagnostic reports it will likely say deficits. But we're looking for differences in social emotional reciprocity, so that's how we relate to each other, how we exchange information. Differences in non-verbal communication, so that's of course all the non-spoken ways that we add meaning to our messages. And then differences in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. And that's relationships at all levels, whether it's your bus driver who picks you up every day or romantic connections with a partner. Then we have the green, restricted and repetitive behaviours. And we're looking for those repetitive motor movements, the way that people move their body, which might not look like it has a purpose. It has a purpose to the autistic person, I can guarantee that, but to the outsider, the movement might not look like it serves any purpose. Repetitive use of objects, so it might be repetitive play routines, for example, in little kids, or repetitive speech. That can be sounds, phrases. These might be relevant to the situation or not. Sometimes it's a learnt chunk of information that's really useful. And other times it's just a fun phrase that they've heard their favourite character say, and they may like to say it over and over for no obvious reason. Next one is the insistence on sameness. And all of us have things that we like to do in a particular way, but it's really that inflexibility and the inability to change. And if they are disrupted or interrupted, that it does cause great distress. Then there's highly restricted and fixated interests. Again, lots of little kids have things that they absolutely love, and they go through their phases of favourites, and that's absolutely expected. It's when difficulty moving away from those really special passions, and if they're at the expense of other interests. And then finally, that under or overreactivity to sensory input. So that's the way that we experience our environment. So what does that really look like? So social communication is the person might be more or less likely to say hello or goodbye. They might not respond to their name being called. They might have difficulty starting or maintaining conversations, especially small talk. That tends to be quite challenging. But at other times, they may really love to talk about their passionate interests. And in that, they might have difficulty interpreting those non-verbal social cues that their conversation partner might be giving, that it's time to change the subject or move on. So they may have difficulty understanding other people's body language. They might be less likely to express their emotions through their facial expressions or their tone of voice. And they might not seek comfort or seek to share how they're feeling with other people. It's really important to note, though, that this doesn't mean that they don't have emotion and they're not feeling anything. It's a difference in the way that they express it. They may use fewer gestures to convey meaning. They might dislike eye contact, and more than dislike, lots of autistic folk actually say that eye contact is really quite painful for them. So it's not that they're disinterested or not listening or rude. It is actually a physically difficult thing for them to do. You might notice a different quality in your child's eye contact. They might look in your direction. They might look around you without giving you that eye gaze. They may have difficulty sharing in imaginative play, which again is not to say they don't have imaginations, which I've spoken to many autistic kids who have talked me through the most amazing, Minecraft builds or, their Lego builds, whatever it might be, and that they absolutely have a beautiful imagination. It's just that difficulty in sharing that imaginative play. And this, of course, means that they may have that difficulty in creating those friendships, and it makes complete sense. If you have difficulty starting conversations and relating to other people and telling other people how you feel, you're going to have trouble making friends and forming relationships. And so we might find that kids are drawn to either younger children who are a bit more forgiving, who don't mind if you don't get all the social nuances correct, or they might seek out older people who are a bit more supportive in conversation than their same-aged peers. So the restricted and repetitive behaviours, we've already spoken a little about this. It might be those repetitive body movements, repetition of words and phrases, strong preference for routines, difficulty with flexible thinking. Often if the autistic person has it set in their mind of how something is going to go or how they would like to do something, changing perspective or changing that might pose a difficulty for them. Highly specific, passionate interests. Often these are unusual for age. I've met 6-year-olds who are right into World War II submarines and can tell you everything about them. So it's going back to my previous sort of example, it's not that, a 6-year-old is really focused on Paw Patrol. It's more that it's a little more unusual for their age. They may be sensory seeking, so they may love to move and spin and bounce. They might lick or sniff things, particularly non-food items. They might run their hands on walls, or conversely, they might be sensory avoiding, and that might look like covering their ears in really busy environments, being irritated by clothing textures, pulling out the tags on their clothes, not liking some foods, for example. So in order to be diagnosed as autistic, a person must demonstrate difficulties in all 3 of those purple social communication criteria and at least 2 of the 4 green restricted and repetitive behaviours. It doesn't matter which 2, but at least 2 of the 4. And that's the requirement that's set out by the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And that's a living document that is updated as research and understanding grows. So pathways to diagnosis, there is, of course, private assessments available, and national guidelines have actually been developed finally, which is a good thing. And they have identified sort of 2 main pathways. And the first is the top line there, which is a single clinician, which we now know as lead practitioner diagnosis. So this is in really clear cases. where the child is well known by the paediatrician or the psychiatrist, and they have the skills and experience to identify autism, they can make that diagnosis with no further assessment from other disciplines. So a paediatrician or a psychiatrist, depending on the age. Where there's a diagnostic dilemma, so where it's not completely clear, or the paediatrician or the psychiatrist doesn't have that knowledge themselves and they want other opinions, that's when they will request the involvement of other disciplines, and typically it is a psychologist and a speech pathologist, and more recently occupational therapists are involved in the can be involved in the process also. So this is called a consensus team diagnosis or a multidisciplinary team diagnosis, and the primary aim of that team diagnosis is to rule out other conditions or to identify co-occurring conditions. So the referral requirements is where things get rather confusing, and the information I'm about to tell you is specific only to WA and only to this moment. It's really subject to change. So currently for that consensus team diagnosis, if the primary practitioner making the referral is a GP, the psychologist involved must be a clinical psychologist for the diagnostic outcome to be considered valid by both the NDIA and the Department of Education. So anecdotally, we're hearing that as wait lists to get in to see a paediatrician are prohibitively long, the NDIA have granted some leeway in that you, if you've gone through a multidisciplinary team assessment and found the outcome to be autistic, you can have access to supports and funding so long as you have that diagnosis ratified by a paediatrician within a 2-year period. I would really encourage you to approach this with caution, though. Make sure that you speak with your school to understand what their individual requirements are to access funding. It can be different between Catholic education and public schools, for example. So please do consult them in the first instance, and of course your referrer, whether it's your GP or your paediatrician. The other pathway is via public assessments. These are government funded, of course, and they're through the Metropolitan CDS or the WA Country Health Service for young people under 16, so long as you have a Medicare card. And you can self-refer to that service, and you can use that system even if you have a private paediatrician. So yes, please do scan the codes or Google those search terms there to find further information. And I'm passing over to Kel.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly. I'm another one of the senior speech pathologists at Therapy Focus, and I started my neurodivergent diagnostic journey in 2020 with an assessment for ADHD, and I was actually the last member of my whole, everyone in my adult is now grown and everyone in my family, sorry, are now grown or all adults. And I was the last in the family to go for an ADHD assessment, and then finished my journey in 2023, last year, when I was the first in the family to go for an autism assessment. So I refer to myself as an AuDHDer, which is sort of like a shortened version for saying that I have an autistic and ADHD combined neurotype. And so I thought that I would talk a little bit about all of the information that Emily just covered is incredibly helpful in terms of understanding the diagnostic and the assessment process, which is, you know, a minefield to navigate. And I know from personal experience that it's a lot. And I think that information would be really, really helpful with navigating that stage. But I wanted to also provide some information for sort of the next steps, because I think a lot of people spend so much time getting through that tricky assessment part, because it is tricky, that then they sort of get that diagnosis and then go like, oh, what's next? So I'm hoping to be able to share some information about that with some examples from my lived experience. So one of the most common responses that I receive from people, especially more so people that don't know me personally, when I tell them that I am autistic, is often either, oh, wow, but you don't look autistic, or the other most common one that I often get is maybe like, oh, no one would ever know. No one would ever know that you were autistic. And whenever that happens, I always think, well, I wonder what you actually think that autism looks like. And so I thought that we could talk about that a little bit. So I've got 3 examples of 3 beautiful clients that I see on my caseload, just to really highlight that I think a lot of people have this stereotypical idea of what autism will look like, and that it tends to maybe be a little boy who really likes planes or trains and, you know, doesn't like loud noises. And you can see that the first presentation there meets a lot of those. You know, this little boy likes to play alone. He loves trains and letters. He really, really does not like loud noises, and he will often get quite upset and cover his ears. That term there, dynamic and discrete dietary preference, is one that you might not have heard before because it's not really being used a huge amount yet, but it's starting to kind of gain popularity. But essentially, it's just a way of describing the fact that his dietary preferences sort of change depending on if he's stressed. He might eat less variety of foods. He might need more bland foods because there's so much other, you know, stuff going on in his life at that time. So that's just a nice affirming way that we've started to use to describe those dietary preferences. He tends to flap his hands when he's excited. He walks on his tippy toes. And he definitely communicates. Emily mentioned earlier that sometimes autistic people will communicate using sort of chunks of information. So we actually call that Gestalt language processing, and we're starting to learn a little bit more about it, which is fantastic. And so he will communicate using sort of scripts and lines from movies that he enjoys. But then you can see that that middle box there is another one of my clients. And she says hello to everyone. She's very, very, very friendly, loves sharing information with people, loves talking to people, has lots and lots and lots of friends. She loves more sharing information that she has rather than listening to information that other people are sharing with her. But she will go back and forth, especially if she knows that by listening to the other person, it means that she's going to get to share more of her favourite information again. She loves fashion. She loves hugs, not light hugs. They have to be really deep bear hugs. She gets really upset if there's changes to her routine, and she frequently interrupts other people when they're speaking. And then the last client is one that clasps their hands really tightly when they're feeling big emotions, has described eye contact to me as hurting when it happens, reads at an incredibly high level. This particular client would only be maybe year 3, and she's reading at a high school level. Would much prefer to play not alone, but just Emily mentioned that sometimes it can be difficult for autistic children to do imaginative play with another person. So she loves to play alongside people, just not with them, and learns really well with visuals. So you can see that really, ultimately, there's no one. There are definitely the traits that have been described in the DSM-5 for diagnostic purposes, and that we are learning more and more when we're thinking about what Emily was mentioning earlier about the cause of autism. And we now know that it is a unique neurotype, which means that the connections in the brain and the parts of the brain actually differ from another neurotype. So the way everything is connected, and certain parts of the brain are different sizes and that sort of thing, that shared neurology results in similar internal experiences, but that ultimately autistic people are human people and no two humans are the same. And that this concept of neurodiversity that has been talked about a lot recently is the concept that previously we've really approached disability from a very medical model, which is that this is your diagnosis, this is what it means is going to be really difficult. And that's not to say that there won't be difficult things, because once again, it's sort of like a human thing, isn't it? That everyone finds some things difficult, and that there definitely are when you're living in an environment that wasn't really designed for the way that your brain is wired. There are probably going to be more things that are challenging than for someone that the environment is designed for. But that really, ultimately, we're all neurodiverse because no two brains are exactly the same. There's always going to be some sort of difference in the wiring, whether it be a big difference or a small one. And that's why that there's no one unique presentation or look to autism, and that all autistic people are unique, and that that's how we should be supporting them, really, in like a unique and individualised way. So these are some of the changes that are starting to become more popular in terms of how we can support the beautiful autistic people in our lives, our children, or if you've got friends or family, or if you're an autistic adult yourself, that we are trying to move away a little bit from that medical model of seeing that it's, something inherently wrong about that person that we need to change, and moving more towards embracing those differences and wherever possible trying to compromise, and just working out how we can kind of hack that environment to sort of make it more appropriate for that person's unique neurology and brain wiring. So I've got a few different categories there for parents. I honestly think that the most important thing that you can do to support your child is just continue to love them, and to make it really clear whenever possible that you love them for exactly who they are, and acknowledge that sometimes things will be hard and sometimes things will be tough, and that you'll be there to support them through that, but that you love them just the way that they are. And I think honestly that makes a really, really, really big difference in terms of overall quality of life and self-esteem for any autistic person, is to just know that they are loved. So I would say, and then also, learning their preferences and their needs, and just helping, especially if you're the parent of a Lily, they need help communicating that. So wherever possible, being able to just, stand up and go, oh no, I'm sorry, my son doesn't do hugs, or oh no, I'm sorry, my daughter doesn't eat that particular food. And seeing that normalised will also make a really, really big difference in their life. I think it's definitely made a really big difference in mine, with my friends in my life being able to help me to advocate for my needs in that way. Schools and workplaces, I think that the biggest change that needs to happen at the moment is that they just need more information. So if there are ever opportunities where you feel that you have the information and you can educate them, I think that parents are the best person. You know your children the best out of anybody. And I think that it's perfect for that education to happen. And then just working together to, wherever possible, put accommodations in place to facilitate engagement in school, or if your child is an adult, or if you know adults in your life, then doing that for work as well. And for support providers, we are trying to make that shift away from being entirely medical and more to that supporting that person for who they are and helping them to navigate different environments and ask for accommodations and educate others about the differences in the way that they prefer to communicate as opposed to somebody else in their workplace. But also making it really clear that it's not that we're asking for, we've kind of gone from the focus being on the autistic person having to change the way that they're communicating to fit in with the majority. And we don't want an opposite where it's then, oh, well, the majority have to change everything about the way they're communicating. We want to try and find a happy middle whenever possible. And really just that education wherever we can, which we're obviously doing right now through this webinar. So this is a little bit about the model of disability that we're trying to move towards in terms of support. So trying to, really normalise accommodations and focus on an entire support system around the person, and helping, families to understand the autistic child's needs and preferences rather than all that focus for change being put on the autistic child. Definitely still acknowledging real challenges and difficulties because they are real and they exist. But trying to, wherever possible, work on sort of improving systems and making changes within systems to suit their neurotype better, which hopefully will result in like longer lasting rather than temporary improvements for comfort. If we're working little by little to change some of those systems and improve the education, we're hoping that environments will just be more inclusive overall. So this is just a little bit of almost like a mindset shift activity where the diagnostic criteria almost has to be written in more of a medical way. That helps to identify whether there's enough of those shared traits that it would mean that it's likely that that person has an autistic neurotype. But the neurodiversity model, so using that more, moving away from the symptoms and how we should treat or change and moving more towards that understanding of that person as a whole, that where we've got that first example of the restricted and repetitive behaviours, that we could reword that as that person finds comfort in certainty and predictability that routines and patterns provide. They might use repetitive movements to communicate joy or to regulate their nervous system and help them to calm, and that they might have deep interests that bring them deep joy, and that's why the range is smaller, because if they have an interest that they're really, 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 that they really love, there's almost like there's not really much room for many more than that, if that makes sense. I think that having that shift helps to move away from what do I need to do to sort of fix this situation to make life better for my child, and more towards, oh, wow, I really understand my child. And even though maybe not everyone will straight away, I can help to then pass on that information, which I know that for myself as an autistic person, that shift, making that shift for myself was really, really helpful, but it also then impacted the way that I support families. And I think that overall, my clients are definitely much happier and navigating environments, in the way that they want to now, in a way that brings them joy. So I think that a lot of that is due to that shift. I just wanted to include some resources, especially there are so many wonderful books that are available to help with making that shift. So not only to support your child with developing that positive identity around their diagnosis and who they are, and that their diagnosis does not have to define exactly who they are, but that no matter what it is, a part of who they are. So being able to, we kind of describe that as having an integrated sense of identity, that I have an identity outside my autism, but that me being autistic will never not be part of my identity because it's the way that my brain is wired, and that I've, done a lot of work for that to make me really happy that that's a part of my identity. So we're hoping to make that shift to sort of promoting that integrated sense of identity earlier on in life, because it is easier to develop it right from the get-go rather than having to sort of change your view of yourself. And so the previous slide had a lot of really great kids books that can help with children building their own sense of identity. But I also think that they're really, really helpful for adults to then understand autistic children as well. And this slide has some resources that are more appropriate for adults. And so not just for that, all of these resources would be really great for autistic adults that have maybe been late diagnosed, but also incredibly helpful for non-autistic adults that want to understand autism better. And then these are some of the shifts that support providers are currently starting to make in terms of the way that we're providing support for autistic people. And so I wanted to include them there just so that you had a little bit of information in case anyone is currently, going through the journey in the process of finding supports for their family and for their child. So some of the way that they're being described at the moment are like green flags, like support provider green flags. If your support providers are allowing space for your child to be their authentic self and providing accommodation so that they can do that. And this might look like having bouncy chairs in the therapy room, having fidgets, not requiring eye contact unless that is a goal for your family. Allowing kids to walk while they're thinking or talking, all those sorts of things. As long as they're acknowledging that the world is not always currently set up or designed for neurodivergent minds, and that this definitely does cause challenges and disability, and that it can fluctuate according to the environment, and helping as a family to really understand and navigate that, because there can be a lot of grief associated with that fluctuating needs. We would want them to be building on your child's strengths and supporting them to recognise how amazing they are and respect their unique preferences, but also helping them to learn about other people's preferences and compromising wherever they can. Breaking down barriers caused by environments. Preferences for communicating is a really, really big one. So if your provider is doing that, I would say that's a really big green flag. And supporting autistic people to connect with neurokin, which is a word that we use to describe other autistic people. Often neurodivergent people feel very isolated and really lonely until they meet other people that have the same neurotype, that do things in a similar way to them. And that can be really, really validating and really freeing. There's a lot of research that shows that having some sort of connection with other neurokin that have a similar neurotype to you is incredibly important in terms of forming that integrated identity that I talked about earlier. And so some of the ways that we're currently doing this at Therapy Focus is that we're working on improving all our office environments and therapy rooms to be more sensory friendly. Clients always have access to equipment that they need to support their regulation in our therapy sessions. We always work collaboratively to identify if there are any accommodations that we need to be providing equipment for, or even if it's just as simple as for some of my clients, if anything's going to change about their session, I make sure that I can, whenever possible, communicate that to them, a week in advance, because any less notice than that will make them feel really stressed. So wherever possible, we find out what needs and preferences are, and we work together to be able to accommodate those whenever we can, and then explain when we can't. We work as a whole unit, so we'll always work with schools and with parents and families and all of the people that are important in that child's life or that adult's life. We've got that we're just about to release. We have a language guide. So Emily talked at the beginning about providing that disclaimer for the difference between identity first and person first language. So we've actually created a guide for all staff at Therapy Focus so that they really understand the differences between those two different types of language. And we're going to be providing training to staff to help support them to be able to ask what people's preferences are. and that we have lots and lots of social connection groups, and that we're currently still building on the sort of variety that we're able to offer. But that's an opportunity for our clients to spend time with other autistic children of a similar age that have similar interests. And the outcomes that we've had from some of those groups have been phenomenal. I've been lucky enough to be part of setting them up. And it's honestly one of my favourite parts of the job, I think, at the moment, is getting to see them form connections and friendships that are long lasting, and, you know, seeing that generate to other amazing outcomes that they're having in their life. And it brings a lot of joy. And these are just some resources that could help with understanding autism a little bit more and sort of knowing where to go next in terms of support.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. That was really great. And thank you also, Emily, for your insightful information. We're now going to circle back and do some Q&A. So we're going to start off by addressing some of the other questions that you had at registration. And we might start off with Kelly for now, if that's okay. And then I'll bring Emily on screen in a moment.
Beautiful. So I will just go through some of the questions that we had and just double check whether they were covered in the presentation or not. I know that we had a question about the different levels, how best to tell a family. I think that question is probably referring to how to tell a family about a diagnosis, depending on different levels of understanding and support. I hope. I'm so sorry if whoever asked that question, I'm sorry if I'm interpreting that incorrectly. But I thought that I would talk a little bit in general about, because obviously discussing diagnosis or the prospect of an assessment with a family is always going to be a very big conversation. And especially when Emily was talking about the differences between diagnostic pathways and that it can be a bit confusing and that information can change. But I think that in terms of sort of giving advice about how to support a family to understand that process, that it's going to look different every time because all families are different too. So I would say that one of the most important things is just making sure that you're respecting the family's preferences and providing whatever information it is that will best help them to understand, I think. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, Emily? Oh, maybe not. That's okay.
We might have just lost her for a moment. She should be back in a moment.
That's okay. And I can always, there was another couple of questions that I can move on to. I hope that answers that question. That was the only one that I wasn't 100% sure if that's exactly the type of answer that whoever was asking that was after, but I hope that answers your question. We also had another question asking for advice about someone in the family that is undiagnosed, but that that particular family is still suspecting that there's something going on that is impacting the rest of the family. So they've been for an assessment, unfortunately didn't get a diagnosis, and now are sort of wondering, you know, where to go next, what to do next. And my advice for that would be that depending on which pathway you're going through, because I know that it's not always as simple as, well, you can ask for a second opinion depending on how that assessment is being funded. But you are entitled to ask for a second opinion. So if you are really quite sure that for your child that they are meeting those diagnostic criteria examples, and that maybe just the paediatrician didn't get to see that in the assessment at the time, or we didn't cover too much in the assessment, but something that is quite common, especially with autistic women, is a concept called masking, which is where, so with the autistic neurotype, there's actually more connections between different parts of the brain. And depending on the person, they can actually get really, really good at observing other behaviour that other people are doing and seeing whether that results in sort of like a good social outcome or not. And then they'll use that information to almost imitate that to then have, better social outcomes for themselves. The only thing with that is that, unfortunately, it's then using or imitating behaviour that's not necessarily suited for the way that their brain is wired. And because of that, it can be, or it is, I know from personal experience that it's really exhausting. It can be a strategy that sometimes I deliberately use in order to navigate a particular environment, but I will then need to sleep for quite a long time afterwards. And if you have that repeated over and over again, it can cause really long-term exhaustion and burnout. So sometimes we have instances where someone hasn't received a diagnosis because they were masking during an assessment as well and just didn't realise, because it can be unconscious. So I would say, your child, and if you really feel that there's something going on there that unfortunately other professionals are just not seeing, I think that wherever possible, being able to give more information to the professionals, and that you are, always entitled to go and see a different professional if you weren't happy with the experience that you had, if that is something that is possible, depending on, what funding pathway that you're navigating.
We had a question about school supports and how to access current best practice. So there is the School of Special Educational Needs Disability, SSEND. It's part of the Department of Education, and it's intended to build capacity of WA public schools to ensure that all children have the same access and inclusion, regardless of established disabilities or any difficulties that they have, even if they haven't got a diagnosis. So this is something that parents can and should request, that their skills access. Essentially, SEND can only be invited into the school. So it's up to you to, I guess, be aware that help is available, and to go and advocate for that with your teachers and your principals. There's a website there that I can share. It's oneclassroom.wa.edu.au, and that has all the information on how to access that and what kind of support they can provide.
And then linking that in, we had another question that said, how can schools be supporting and identifying autism? And Emily has written some notes here in our where we've got all the questions, saying that the school should be always included in the process of assessment as well. So the professionals that are doing the diagnosis should be consulting with the school, and that there are occasions where then some more education can be. And if you are then accessing support from, say, a therapy provider later on, that therapy providers can also liaise with schools. So in terms of accessing that current best practice, if you have health professionals on board, they can absolutely get in contact with your child's teacher and make sure that they're sharing all of those, collaborative strategies that you're all setting together so that everyone can be on the same page.
We had some people asking about perhaps screening tools that are available. And there, of course, there are, and some are better than others, and some are validated and some are not. So I would really encourage you to approach them with caution. And perhaps in the first instance, if you have a real little-y, then it can be best to really try and access those screeners through your child health nurse or your GP. If you're already accessing therapy services, speech or OT, those therapists can often point you in the right direction of a quality screener. Where they can sometimes be useful is for guiding your thinking and giving you more information, so that when you do get in front of that paediatrician or that health professional, you can give them really clear examples of what your child is experiencing. But as I said, it's not a straightforward tick a box kind of process. So there's no one perfect tool, but they can guide your thinking. So there are a couple there. I'm hesitant to give you, but at any rate, Autism Spectrum Screening Questionnaires is a good place to start for that about 6 years old. And then there's the an autism checklist in toddlers for under 3-year-olds.
And if you have a health professional already on board, they might even be able to help you to complete the questionnaire, because they can be really difficult to use and understand if you're not familiar with them. Some of them are sort of written more for GPs or health professionals, so that's why it can be really difficult to navigate whether it's going to be a parent questionnaire or a GP questionnaire. So when in doubt, if you have, or if you've got a GP that you could talk to about it with, or the health nurse, just sort of, wherever possible, getting a little bit more support to guide those questions in that conversation.
Where to next? We had a question about Asperger's. So this is no longer a standalone diagnosis. The current version of the DSM-5 we're up to, as I mentioned before, it's an evolving document. So now, as understanding has changed, we've moved on from that as a standalone diagnosis. Essentially, they would have experienced similar social interaction and repetitive behaviours, but with no clinically significant difficulties in language and cognition. So now we just have that one diagnostic framework where it's autism spectrum disorder, but we use the specifiers with or without language impairment, with or without cognition impairment, and of course stating those support levels.
And it just ties into what we discussed during the webinar about those different presentations, that despite that there are those common, unique wiring differences that are generally part of the overall neurotype, that no one has the exact. And so someone might have more connections in the language part of the brain, and that might be why they present with, less difficulties with communicating than others. And that's why it was removed as a separate diagnosis and just embraced more of that there are individual differences between all people. And I think that pretty much brings us to time.
Thank you both, Emily and Kelly, so much. There's a couple of questions come through in the chat. I'll just read the first one out. So, what assistance can be accessed for those who homeschool?
That's a very good question. I actually don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. So if Emily does, if she doesn't, then we can go away and find out a little bit of information to provide as part of, papers or wherever we're going to be putting some of the resources. But I do apologise here on the spot. I couldn't actually specifically, other than a lot of the resources that we've already discussed in terms of more informal, the beautiful books or the websites. But in terms of formal Department of Education supports, I'm not sure.
No, I couldn't tell you either, I'm afraid. But yeah, similar to what Kel has already touched on, it's just really capitalising on your child's strengths and delivering information in a way that is going to be, setting them up for success. But yeah, the formal supports, not sure. We'll have to get back to you on that.
I do know that it is a very, very common, there's actually been some investigations done through the government into sort of life outcomes of autistic people, and that it is very, very common for, I think that the percentage was around 68% of autistic adults reported that they found school to be very difficult, that unfortunately, especially these adults are being interviewed now. And so when they were in school, there was even less information available. And so environments might not have been as accommodating as they needed to be in order for that person to feel comfortable there. And so it is not uncommon for autistic children to end up either doing a combination of direct at school and a little bit homeschool. So I do know that there must be, I think that's a fantastic question. I look forward to going away and having a look at some of the resources, because there must be some available. And so that's a sort of a to be continued answer, I think.
No worries, thank you. One other one that's come through is working in a childcare setting. How do we begin to have conversations with parents?
Yeah, that's it. It can be a difficult conversation to start. But I guess sensitively is a very obvious answer to that question, and perhaps gauging their understanding and their feeling about their child first.
Yeah. And sort of wherever possible, trying to get an inkling of where they are on their journey, because I know that if people had come to me and suggested that I was autistic before I was ready to acknowledge that fact about myself and decide to look into the potential of a diagnosis, for me as an adult, that would have been very distressing if someone had tried to sort of really suggest that when I wasn't ready for that conversation. And so, as you can imagine, for parents of younger children, it can be very, very similar experience. And it doesn't mean don't say anything, but just that there, has to be respect, and has to be just sort of trying to figure out whether, or might they be ready for me to maybe give some information, and then doing that in a really supportive way and being there for them for that potential, or I wasn't expecting that might happen after you start that conversation. And yeah, just really, really, wherever possible, working through it together, I think.
Thank you. One other question we had is, we are currently working with a speech therapist and an OT. They are seeing autism signs. What pathway do we need to go down to get a diagnosis if we already have those professionals involved, but they have no relationship with a GP or a paediatrician?
Yeah. So you absolutely do need to get a referral happening first to have that formal assessment done. You're not able to use any NDIS funding for autism assessments, so it will be something that happens outside of the therapy that you're already experiencing. That said, your speechy and your OT are going to be excellent resources for the diagnostic team, and they will absolutely confer with them and get their perspectives and their understanding of your child. But if you, I would start with your GP, because they're going to be the easiest to get into, and get their referral and get on some wait lists, which is not a great answer, but
absolutely, because even though certain speech pathologists and OTs can be part of that diagnostic process, it's not all speech pathologists and OTs. There's specific training that the speech pathologists and OTs that are part of the diagnostic teams go through in order for them to be considered to have the right skills to be able to provide that as part of that team. So you know, even if your speech pathologist did have those requirements, it might even still sort of different from person to person. But I would say that it's probably likely that it would be that your therapy team can absolutely provide that information to the diagnostic team, but it's probably likely that unfortunately they don't have the right kind of qualifications in order to actually do the diagnosis for you. Worth asking though, just in case.
Thanks for that. That was all the questions that have come through on the chat. So I think we've covered everything. Thank you so much to you both, Emily and Kelly, for your time today and your information for all the families and carers on this journey. Really appreciate it, and we hope that you've all taken something away from today. I'd just also like to thank Carrie Clark and the amazing team at Kind. We've obviously been working together to bring this webinar forward for everyone to digest. So we really appreciate everything we've been doing with Kind. Both websites will host this webinar soon, and both websites are also great information sources for much of resources, insightful information, where to start, where to go. So by all means, check them both out. So thanks again for everyone joining online, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.